So some rather big character changes coming to 10th edition Warhammer 40K. Aura leadership abilities are more or less gone. Most characters, but not all, will join units, and having a lieutenant lead your forces can get you some auto wounds. Let's talk about what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's new character rules preview, and again some fairly seismic changes to the status quo here. Quite a lot of previews, both as to how a few specific units will work, and also character rules in general. First up, as they'd hinted, they have confirmed that characters will be able to join units again, as they did back in 7th edition, though it seems in a fairly different format to how they do now. I made a previous video on that one talking about that change a little while back. Now we actually know the rules, how they're going to be implemented though. Probably the biggest takeaways from the article are this. The majority of support characters will now lead units, and they'll give bonus rules just to that unit as opposed to aura abilities, which are largely going to be gone. A few units will instead count as lone operatives and operate kinda similar to how they do at the moment. The lookout sir is kind of simplified, and they've given us a specific preview for Primaris lieutenant rules, letting us know exactly what squads they'll be able to join and what rules they'll give. Let's go through them bit by bit and talk about what we've got. First up, I think it's pretty interesting that basically auras are no longer going to be a major thing in Warhammer 40k at the moment. These were introduced towards the start of 8th edition, character buffs that usually went out to a bobble of 6 inches, often giving you rerolls like the captain or lieutenant ones, reroll ones to hit or wound. For the most part I kind of found them pretty fun, actually ways that your characters could influence the damage of units. That wasn't always the biggest thing before 8th edition, though it could mean that certain armies just got a bit castle-y maybe, or wanting to clump together and put the character rerolls all into one big death stack. 9th edition I think went some way to mitigate that, introducing the core keywords to put auras on the things that they were more intended to, plus the way that 9th edition missions and terrain works meant that big Death Star castles just weren't quite as viable, as you might not be able to see the things that you needed to shoot. In any case, it seems like the vast majority of auras are going to be removed from the game now. They've said that they're removing them due to making balance tricky, due to stacking synergies on multiple units. It can be kind of hard to balance a unit both in its unbuffed form and also if it's got the best auras going, so I kind of see their point there. It seems that now for the most part buffing characters will give extra rules to the actual unit that they're leading, just the one single unit, though apparently some big and important units will still get aura-like abilities. I suspect that that's probably more going to be for the case for things like say Primarch class models and other Supreme Commanders, probably things that get these new lone operative rules but are also leaders in their own right. In general, I've got kind of mixed feelings about the removal of auras for the most part. For the most part, I feel like they made a lot of intuitive sense. It meant that you often had characters that are holding in the middle of your formation directing things, and I quite like the way that it did reward in-game positioning as well. Definitely had a few bits of weirdness though, things like units charging out of aura range so they couldn't get affected by their commander. They did maybe make the game a little bit more castle-y, and maybe increase the bloat of rerolls as well I guess. I'm sure at least some people won't be too sorry to see them gone, but as 40k game mechanics go, I thought they worked okay-ish. In their place now, apparently the most buffing characters will be attaching to units, not literally all of them, but the majority of them it would seem. Most standard infantry characters and things will get a leader ability, allowing them to join certain squads. The characters that have this leader ability don't need to be declared on your list roster where they will be joining, but they each would generally be assigned a squad during deployment, apparently at the same stage when you allocate things like reserves and transports, making a few basic decisions about how the units in your army will function this game. From there, unlike the previous independent characters of the past, you won't be able to bounce in and out of units and join and leave them. You're stuck in that same unit for the entire game long. Essentially, the character is kind of going to function like a very fancy sergeant, giving you potential buffing abilities to the unit, plus their own combat stats. For the most part, apparently each unit will only be able to be joined by one character, barring a few named exceptions. The examples that they give here are captains and lieutenants in the same unit, Eldar Farseers and Warlocks, and the Biophages from the Genestealer cult. Perhaps he'll be able to add on to things like the Abominant or the Primus perhaps. Then it does sound like exactly which units they can join is fairly prescribed. You're not just going to be able to have your infantry characters just mix it up between literally every infantry unit in the army. It sounds like characters of a given flavour will have to join units of a given flavour, and it seems that which units they'll be able to join will depend pretty heavily on things like lore, the unit type, the armour type, or maybe the class within an army. Say for example, I suspect that Necron Destroyer units will only be able to be joined by Destroyer characters, likely Space Marine Bikers by Biker characters, Jump Pack units with characters with Jump Packs, and so on and so forth. It seems that for Space Marine characters, judging by the Lieutenant example that we'll take a look at towards the end of the video, that's going to be limited by armour. Say for example, a standard Primaris Lieutenant can't join Gravis or Phobos units, at least by Games Workshop's preview. This does seem kind of restrictive compared with currently. At the moment the character system is kind of freeform. I guess it might make squads make a little bit more sense to look at on the tabletop, and I suppose could potentially make Games Workshop's balanced job a little bit easier if they only have to look at interactions between a certain amount of units. Definitely does reduce a fair bit of flexibility though. Then in terms of the character protection that they get, it sounds like they're basically just going to be another model within that unit, so that usually means that they're going to be the last to die within that squad, at least if the damage allocation stays the same as currently. They do say in the article there's going to be certain weapon abilities that can potentially hurt them first. I strongly suspect that that's the one that they already talked about briefly, the precision keyword. I think that that's going to be the one that applies to sniper rifles, and we saw it mentioned in a Tyranid army rule. If you happen to specialise your Tyranids against characters, then 6s to hit will get precision. I guess that might give you the chance to damage the character early, and then when all their bodyguards are dead, things like multi-unit characters like captains plus lieutenants, they would then break apart into their individual squads and operate independently from there. My guess would be that the rest of the squad would have to take damage before the character, and hopefully they'll stop anyone from going back to the weird tanking character shenanigans that we had back in 7th edition, where you could choose to take a save on either the character's good armour or the squad's bad armour, and potentially game either strong or weak hits depending on that. Finally, in terms of buffs for the units, it sounds like these buffing characters will just give you special rules for that squad. We'll take a look at the Primaris Lieutenant's one in just a second. That one seems to give you attacks, lethal hits, plus the ability to fall back, shoot and charge. I'd guess that the more basic characters will help damage in some way, but it looks like there will be fewer rerolls in the game, and the damage buffs will come in other ways, such as the auto-wounding one, or maybe the exploding 6s that we saw before. Again, as mentioned, it sounds like it's mainly just going to be the single unit that they're leading, as opposed to multiple squads affected by auras now. Then, and kind of interestingly, it sounds like we're getting a bit of a split tier system between the two different character sets. As well as these leader types, we're also getting a second set called Lone Operatives, as really there are a lot of characters that don't go around with retinues of squads, and they give a whole bunch of examples, things like Vindicare Assassins that operate alone, Commander Shadow Sun, and maybe medium unit sized characters like that. They say that Lionel Johnson will also operate like this. I guess that kind of puts pays to any speculation about the Blade Guard running alongside him as having a big rules function. And it also seems that things like Tech Marines or Ironfather Fyros, things that buff vehicles, I guess they wouldn't necessarily be in a squad. They need to be with their tanks and war machines. The Lone Operatives character system is maybe a little bit more similar to the one that we have currently. They'll all go around on their own just as they do now, and basically all they've done is slightly simplified the Lookout Sir system, basically meaning that the character can't be shot from greater than 12 inches away. Sometimes it's going to be conditional, and sometimes it's going to be on all the time. It sounds like for the units that are a bit more stealthy, things like the Vindicare or Shadow Sun, it would basically be just all the time. You'd actually have to get close to those characters to damage them at all. But for other more support or leader class characters, it will be dependent on having some units nearby, kind of similar to how Lookout Sir works in 9th. Lionel Johnson apparently requires some Space Marine infantry nearby to get this rule, and Ironfather Fyros and presumably other Tech Marine equivalents would need a vehicle nearby so they don't get shot. A lot of these maybe might just be jumping around using damage dealing stuff. I'm sure a whole bunch of them will be using buffing abilities though. I guess these will be using things like auras or single unit targeted buffs, much like the Tech Marines and the auras that we have at the moment. It sounds like these are perhaps going to be the exception rather than the rule though. Things that buff vehicles, stealthy units that work on their own, and really big characters that maybe don't make sense to just be leading one squad as they're too big and important like Primarchs. Overall, before we look at the Lieutenant rules, there's really quite a lot to unpack here. First up, I do find the idea that there's two different systems just a little bit surprising. Maybe seems to go a little bit against their idea of simplicity, but to be honest, both of the systems seem very simple in themselves, and they do away with perhaps some of the more complex or slightly headachy mechanics of Ninth Edition. Things like the Lookout Sir rule and Heroic Intervention, I feel like they maybe weren't the most obvious mechanics to get a grasp of if you didn't have someone talking them through for you. The one seems to be very simplified, and I suspect that Heroic Intervention will just be entirely gone, as it's not really needed quite as much. For the leader characters, it's going to be interesting that I think there's probably going to be some leaders that are more sort of buffing units for the squads, kind of like fancy sergeants with a bit of combat gear, but mainly there to provide some powerful special rules. And on the flip side, I feel like there's going to be some leaders that just have some, say, awesome melee stats or something, and the squad's just going to be there as ablative wounds to get them into combat so they don't die too easily. Kind of interesting that this system could have both. Compared with currently, any of these leader characters won't be able to go venturing off on their own anymore. It might have implications for things like holding objectives. You can't just send a character to do it now. And you're usually going to have units a bit more independent and going around on their own, as opposed to having one character support an entire formation. As I talked about a bit in the previous video, having characters actually attached to units could clear up quite a bit of combat weirdness that we have in 8th and 9th edition. Things like, say, having a Space Marine captain and their squad standing next to each other, and then having strange situations like the character fails their charge but the squad succeeds, and then charges off, leaving them no support. If the character and the squad are charging and fighting as one, then I guess that clears that up. And also other things like both of the units fighting, then the enemy using the combat interrupt stratagem to fight between the one and the other, maybe killing either the character or the squad before they get to fight. I can perhaps see why they have tried to limit characters to being in certain units for game balance and things. I feel like it could also have a pretty big knock-on effect to certain people's collections though. I'd guess there's going to be at least a fair few people out there who have a leader character that now can't attach to any of their squads, or can only attach to one that's very suboptimal. Going by the Primaris Lieutenant example, I'd guess things like the Primaris Bike Chaplain to maybe only be able to attach to Space Marine Outriders, or maybe ATVs if they're allowed. Means that if you had a Primaris Biker Chaplain and you don't have any Outriders, they might be borderline unusable. Obviously that's just a bit of speculation at the moment, but it seems like it's a pretty reasonable guess. The same might be true of things like jump pack characters if you don't have a whole bunch of jump packs, or things like captains or lieutenants in certain marks of armour. For the lone operatives, I do kind of like the very straightforward Lookout Sir rules. Again, they're definitely a lot less fiddly than the 9th edition ones. It's just basically, if you're not within 12 inches you can't shoot this character, provided the enemy character has met any requirements that they need to, such as being near a unit if that's necessary. Perhaps the two things that most occur for that is that you could have a character just hiding completely in the open now, if say they were a stealthy one like a Vindicare Assassin or Shadow Sun. I guess that could have implications for objectives. You might be able to have a character that's basically invulnerable at long range. If they've got any objective control points, then basically that's an objective taken that your opponent can't do anything about unless they get very close. For all we know at this point though, the objective rules might address that in some way. The other thing that I first thought of is that it means that characters will be able to get shot even if they're safe behind a battle line now. Say for example, if you did have Mr. Lionel Johnson leading a whole bunch of Deathwing Terminators into battle, unless he's got any other special rules and things, then it sounds like if you got your units close enough to that Deathwing battle line, they'd be able to directly shoot the Primarch, even if he's safe behind a Terminator shield wall. Again, that's going to require a bit of change of thinking. It might be more important to stop the opponent from getting in range of the character, as opposed to keeping them behind your units. Finally, Games Workshop were good enough to give us a specific example for their single favourite unit in Warhammer 40K. Here we have the rules that the Primaris Lieutenant gives. It looks like it's the abilities section of the datasheet, so that bit on the right in the 10th edition ones. He's got the core ability that he is a leader, so that allows him to join units. The faction ability of Oath of Moment for those big rerolls. Looks like that's not just tied to previously core units anyway. And then he gives the unit that he's joined the lethal hits and target priority abilities. Lethal hits will mean that the ranged and melee weapons all get 6s to hit auto wound. And I guess that bit is instead of the classic reroll 1s to wound that lieutenant equivalents have had in 9th. Kind of an interesting side grade this one. It's going to be extra good on low strength weapons, things that were only going to wound on a 4 or worse. For things like a standard Space Marine Bolter wounding on a 4, it will be slightly weaker than the reroll 1s to wound buff that he has, but if you're wounding on a 5 or 6, it would actually be doing a bit better. It's kind of strange that it doesn't scale evenly, to be honest. It's going to be far better on lower strength things than compared with things like Hell Blasters, which he can attach to. I guess they've gone for this particular rule to cut down on rerolls and make the game fast, rather than having just a very even buff like the rerolls that applies to everything pretty much the same. He has also acquired a second ability as well. He's got target priority, which means that the unit he's joined to can fall back, shoot and charge. Really quite a nice one to have on a big fighter unit, or even just as an insurance for a gunline unit potentially. That way they wouldn't be able to be locked in combat, and if they are engaged on the front lines, being able to fall back, shoot and charge a different target would give you far more options as to where your nasty unit gets stuck in. Overall, generally seems helpful. I guess it will depend on the points cost that he is and what other abilities he might have access to, as to whether or not people are generally interested in running them in any great numbers. Then, perhaps just as interesting is the list of units that this guy can actually join. For me, the most interesting thing is just how small the list of units is. It's literally just Assault and Regular Intercessors, Hellblasters and Blade Guard Veterans, and then 2 units that have the redacted sign by them, which I'm pretty sure will be new releases for 10th edition 40k. I would guess, given the Space Marine preview trailer, it'll be that unit of Flamer Space Marines and the Combi Weapon Veterans that we saw in the big reveal. Both of those would kind of make sense as standard Space Marines in the Mark 10 armor. It is kind of surprising that he literally can't join any of the other units though. He can't join Gravis things like the Eradicators, he can't join Phobos like the Infiltrators or Incursors or Reavers, he can't join any Firstborn units. I guess literally all of those classes can only be joined by their own lieutenants, so I guess Games Workshop just want you to collect them all. I guess from this rule it would look like the Primaris Firstborn divide is at least alive and well in some way. Rather than squads and transports now, it looks like their characters might be somewhat divided, Primaris ones leading Primaris and Firstborn leading Firstborn, at least judging by this. I guess that's all still a little bit speculative at this point, seeing as we haven't seen full rules for anything, but it seems kind of likely from the implication of this. Finally, they did say in the rules that he can join units of either a captain or a chapter master attached. Could be interesting to have some sort of synergy between him and a captain. I guess that would be double dipping on buffs. And I kind of wonder whether the captain might give you 6s to hit explode as well. We already saw that from a sustained hits rule, so it's certainly in the game if Games Workshop want to go that way. It's also confirmed that chapter masters are going to be a thing in some way, shape or form. I guess we'll have the named ones, but it'll be interesting to see if we get a generic one. It'll be interesting to see how they implement that, whether it's on its own datasheet, an upgrade on the captain datasheet, or something like one of the 6 Space Marine stratagems from the Gladius Strike Force. In any case, it's still a thing, and I'm sure they'll be getting even more out of their units. Anyway though, let me know your thoughts on the new character changes. What do you make of the way that they've done it? Do you think that characters being basically jumped up squad sergeants or lone operatives is a good thing? And let me know if there's any other big implications that I've missed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.